The way you just described that the well mind being more open, being more flexible. When I'm depressed, it's really stuck and it's rigid and it's negative and it's dark and it's heavy and I can't shake it off when I'm in that space. It's really, really hard.
The symptoms that are often associated with depression are kind of low mood, low energy, and anhedonia, which is a difficulty or inability to feel pleasure, and then also trouble concentrating.
I love the emphasis on family as well. I know for me, I've got 2 young kids and they're probably the best medicines for me coming out of depression. Is just time with them, hugs with them, and being out in nature. It helps me to kind of flick that switch. Our guest today is Dr. Manesh Girn, a close colleague of mine. So Dr. Gern's a postdoctoral neuroscientist at the University of California, San Francisco, a scientific author, teacher, and YouTube creator. At UCSF, Manesh specializes in researching psychedelic drugs, working alongside Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. He particularly investigates the neural mechanisms of psychedelic experiences and their impact on mental health and well-being. Dr. Gern has authored or co-authored over 20 peer-reviewed publications on topics including psychedelics, brain networks, cognition, and mental health. Manesh also runs the Psychedelic Scientist, a popular platform on Instagram and YouTube where he creates educational content at the intersection of psychedelics, neuroscience, and mental health. And finally, Manesh is scientific director at the Center for Minds, a non-profit research organization exploring the potential of psychedelics and consciousness practices to facilitate creativity and breakthrough insight into real-world contexts. Neuroscience 101, especially how Manesh conceptualizes the brain and our ability to maximize its potential to heal from depression, trauma, and addiction, but also to be more creative and socially vibrant. And the hot topic of neuroplasticity also comes up, as does everyone's favorite neurotransmitter, 5-HT2A. Great to see you again. You're in San Francisco and you've had an amazing career so far. I loved watching everything you've been doing, especially becoming a doctor. So how does it feel, first of all, getting your PhD, being a doctor, and then getting all the way to San Francisco at UCSF?
Yeah, thanks, David. It's been great. I mean, it was my goal from my late teens to be a psychedelic researcher and to be a neuroscientist. And so to be
Yeah.
here at, working at UCSF with Robin Carhart-Harris, who's the leader in the field, and just enjoying living in San Francisco. It's kind of a dream come true, so it's been a lot of fun.
Beautiful. Yeah, what's it like working with Dr. Robin Carr-Harris? He literally is kind of top psychedelic scientist in the world.
Yeah, he's great. I've known him for quite some time now. We first connected back in around 2018, and so we built a relationship over the years. And coming here was such a natural choice, and now being here with him, it's very easy to work with him. And something I like about him a lot is he always said from the beginning, he's like, "You're coming here not to work for me, but to work with me." And so it's great. He treats people as his colleagues, and he's very respectful in that way. And it's just been a great collaboration.
You're a psychedelic neuroscientist, and you've got a YouTube channel called The Psychedelic Scientist, yeah?
Yes.
So I've
Correct.
been checking it out because, I'm starting to move into the YouTube world. You've got a really cool way of explaining things and teaching pretty complicated stuff. So why is education so important to you about the brain, how it works, and also psychedelic neuroscience itself?
So my interest in that really emerged during the pandemic when, I found on one side me having a lot more time and also having a desire to do something that's more immediately impactful. And back then, around 2020, 2021, we're kind of at the peak of the hype cycle for psychedelics. Lots of money pouring in.
Really?
People were all into it, talking about it. It's at a different stage now, but that was kind of the peak. And at that time, I also realized how much bad media there is on psychedelics out there. A lot of misinformation, a lot of sensationalizing, and just a lot of people talking about the science who just did not have a scientific background, right? Who weren't scientists and who weren't actually reading the primary research literature in a way, in like a nuanced way. And so I wanted to fill that vacuum and make content that's scientifically rigorous and aligned with with what the research actually says, but is kind of more accessible and digestible by people with non-scientific backgrounds. And so that kind of got me on this path, and I really enjoy it with the YouTube and Instagram. And I've been on many, many podcasts, as you know, and I have a course that I've released. And so I'm just trying to really tap into that. And I enjoy it a lot. I truly do enjoy it.
What about the brain in particular, Manesh? fascinates you the most? Why was it that part of our body that
It's a
most
good
interests
question.
you?
Yeah, for me, it fascinated me from an early age, particularly through my early psilocybin journeys,
Hmm.
that our brain is essentially constructing our experience of reality, right? It's actively creating it, and by altering our pharmacology, by ingesting certain things or engaging in certain practices, you can radically change how you perceive the world. And that just got me really interested in kind of how we're constructing a world, how that could be changed, how something can be more clear and expansive versus contracted, and just how to modulate our interface with the external world and ourselves. And so that was all really interesting to me. And that these kinds of kind of airy subjective topics were now starting to be studied in more of a rigorous scientific way with brain imaging and these other kind of modalities. And so then I thought very early on, like, this is fascinating. This is expanding to some of the coolest stuff, linking subjective states and spirituality with science. It's like, how can I not be into that?
Beautiful. And I love how you're combining your own personal experiences with psychedelics. And thanks for mentioning that, using psilocybin and how that inspires you and gets your kind of creative juices going. And then you're coming in at this amazing time where science is just exploding around psychedelics, and technology with MRI and fMRI is exploding as well. So yeah, this is an amazing time to be doing what you're doing. Maybe it's a great time as well just to tell us what the brain is. Like, how would you explain it to someone like me that's not a psychedelic neuroscientist? Like, what are some of the key features of how the brain works? So I'm thinking neurons, synapse transmitters, receptors, the different kind of components of the brain, things like that.
For sure. So, the brain is comprised of all sorts of different types of cells, right? But the main one is our neurons, which are your main type of brain cell. So you could think of your brain as this extremely complex network of different cells that are interacting in different ways. And so, like as I just said, the main ones are neurons, and these are essentially, you could think of them as sending information between each other. And they do this through electrical impulses, which are carried through chemical signals. And to give you a sense of it, the brain has about 100 billion neurons, each connected with up to 10,000 other neurons. So we get into crazy levels of magnitude of complexity.
Hmm.
And so a given neuron communicates with other neurons by sending chemicals called neurotransmitters, like such as serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, glutamate, etc. And then those change whether the other neurons get to activate or not. Right? That's in the simplest way to describe it. There's a lot more there, but that's the general most important thing. And so you get these kind of networks of connections and they form different patterns. And so there's kind of like small patterns of a population of these neurons, like 100,000 to a million of them, which might like process something like shapes and shadows in your visual perception, right? And those populations then come together to create a brain region, which might process faces. This is the region for faces. It's called the fusiform face gyrus. Is a part of the brain that seems to be selected for faces. But
Wow.
that part is based on these more simple building blocks. And so you get this kind of hierarchy of building blocks that then ultimately create our perception of the world and our body and our thoughts and all these different things. And so there's multiple layers to it. And these days, a lot of people talk about brain networks. And what those are collections of brain regions, which carry out more complex things. And so I feel like you're probably going to ask me about the default mode network, because this
Yeah.
is talked about in psychedelics a lot. And so this is a network. So it's a set of brain regions which interact in certain ways to give rise to some of the more complex forms of our thinking. So our ability to create a personal narrative on who we are, kind of our story, and like, I'm this person with these kinds of traits, and this is my past, and this is likely to be my future. Those regions and that network come together to perform that. And in addition to that, our ability to remember the past or imagine the future is related to this network. Our ability to think about the beliefs about other people, and just our ability to think in an abstract way more generally. And so that's an example of really complex functions, right? Like, those require a lot of building blocks. But this network seems to come together to do that, to perform that for us. And so, yeah, that's in a nutshell the different layers of the way the brain processes the world.
I love that you said in a nutshell, because walnuts within nutshells are much like our brain in our kind of cranium. So yeah, there's it's amazing, isn't it, the brain? Do you feel like we've understanding it well right now? Or like what kind of grade would we be in? Are we kind of still in kind of kindergarten, or are we in high school? Because you don't have to use that analogy, but how much are we starting to learn about the brain? I know we don't know what it truly is, but what's your sense around so far what we do grasp around how it works and how to actually kind of work with how it works?
Yeah, it's really tricky because our access to the brain, at least in humans, is proportional to what kind of technology we can use to look at it. And because you can imagine the brain is in our skull, and we can't just be slicing open people's brains to look at it. And so it's like, okay, how do we look into the brain while somebody's alive? And this is where brain imaging comes in, and each type of brain imaging has its own limitations. Some might be very precise over time, but you don't know exactly which region's giving rise to the activity. Or some are very precise, where you can say these are the exact regions that are likely being activated, but you can only get snapshots every 2 seconds or something like this. And so there's inherent
Mm.
limitations. And so, in essence, neuroscience is the study of the brain as revealed through our methods. And the brain, in and of itself, is extraordinarily complex and detailed. And we're just in kind of looking at it in different layers of approximation, different layers of models, and some from humans, as I just described, but also from rodents and other animals whose brains we can slice up. We get them to do things, sacrifice them, slice up their brains. A lot of research does that. And so we're building up this understanding based on our limited methods. And so, on one level, through these methods, we've pushed them pretty far so far in terms of what they're able to tell us, and we're trying to construct models and theories on how to tie it all together. So in that sense, we feel like we're gaining more and more knowledge, but it's very possible that the next few years, next decade, a totally new type of brain imaging technology is going to emerge, which throws that all. It's like, oh, that was all only partially true, and now this is what it's actually like. And so in that way, it's like hard to know how much we truly understand. It's almost like this, it's always this iterative kind of paradigm after paradigm model. And a good example that's coming is like, there was in physics, there's an old school like Newtonian physics and understanding gravity as a force, and of kind of his own set of equations for what gravity is and so on that Newton kind of came up with. But then Einstein came with general relativity, saying that space and time are this one unified thing, and that gravity is a result of the curvature of space-time. It's not a force in the way that Newton understood it. And he had a whole set of equations for the same phenomena, which explained it slightly better and explained certain quirky things that were anomalous. So this is a case where we felt like we truly understand the nature of reality with Newton, and it was like, oh, like that was approximately true, but then there's a whole other framework which encapsulates that in a broader framework, if that makes sense. And so I think neuroscience likely has a lot more of those to come. And so it's like this iterative process. But I mean, with that all said, it's like we are making progress, and it's happening at a rapid pace, but it's extraordinarily complex. Like the brain is extraordinarily complex.
Yeah, and there's a beautiful humility of what you're talking about there, that is incredible. Our technology is, as much as we are revealing, we still don't know what we don't know, and the brain itself is this amazing thing. And I wanted to ask you, Manesh, what makes psychedelics so special? How are they fundamentally different in how they work, how they impact upon a human, and definitely neurologically speaking, how it affects the brain and our functioning compared to, say, standard psychopharmacology?
One thing, I mean, there's a few ways to answer that question. I think one is that unlike things like, SSRIs or typical antidepressants, psychedelics induce this really powerful consciousness altering experience. Like you're in this very intense experience for X number of hours. And the other interesting thing is about that experience is that it's not always the same, right? If you take some Adderall, sure, you're having an experience for a certain number of hours, but it's pretty consistent. You're gonna maybe feel a bit euphoric. You're gonna be very wakeful. You might want to talk a bit more. You're able to focus on things, and that's pretty reliable. And you drink some alcohol. It's kind of you kind of can anticipate what's gonna happen. But with psychedelics, it's very powerful, and there's always a layer of unpredictability. And that's because it really interacts with other factors, like the context you're in, set and setting, as we call it, where set is kind of our mindset, our beliefs, our personality, our past memories or expectations. And then setting is the physical environment you're in, the people around you, and some might say even it's the cultural environment more broadly. And so psychedelics really influence our sensitivity to what's already going on and kind of catalyze that. And that goes back to psychedelic, the word, which means psyche, like mind, psyche, and then delic, which means to bring forth or manifest. So it's really to bring forth the mind. And so psychedelics affect the serotonin system in the brain, and particularly this receptor called the serotonin 2A receptor. And we could talk more about that, but through its effects on that receptor, it really shakes the foundations of how we create our world and how we perceive and relate to it. And it's this really complex interaction that can disrupt what seems to be the fundamental structures of our experience temporarily.
I don't know if I'm making a correct interpretation of part of what you're saying, Manesh, but it seems almost like the unpredictability of psychedelics is what makes them special in a sense, is that the unpredictability perhaps enables a person to have a more of a kind of personalized, customized experience of how that medicine journey may well need to help them the most. Whereas I think if everyone has this kind of homogenous, kind of really same experience with an SSRI, for example, it's even though it's not like a kind of AI generated personalized medicine, there's something about psychedelics that they have completely different effects on people at different times. So it's less predictable. It's kind of I would want to say you want to obviously have more preparation and intention around using them compared to just popping a regular medicine. But what is it around that kind of unpredictability or that mystery or that ability of psychedelics to find within a person and to help them find within themselves that part that perhaps would benefit the most from true healing?
Yeah, this is really interesting because, as you're saying, it does seem to be for a lot of people that when they're just able to feel safe and secure in their environment and feel supported and surrender into the experience. And I'm particularly thinking of, let's say, psilocybin or even LSD, or, for that matter, ayahuasca, DMT, mescaline, these kind of classical psychedelics. That this seems to be the case when people feel safe and are able to lean into it. It takes them almost where they need to go in order to process past emotions and memories. And there seems to be this almost intrinsic intelligence to it. And some have called it the inner healing intelligence. And the idea is that it seems to kind of catalyze this process where your psyche or your mind's inbuilt ability to maintain its own homeostasis and find its own healing is activated. Or in other words, another way to say it is like it's breaking the kind of constraints or limitations on your mind so it's able to just naturally move where it needs to go to resolve tension, intrinsic tensions.
Hmm.
And we don't fully understand how that process works or why that happens. It just seems to be the case that people will start to grieve something from 10 years ago that they didn't realize they needed to process. And that'll create changes in their lives. And so I think it's a good point that it is kind of intrinsically personalized in this way, because it interacts with your own your own psychological makeup and guides you in particular directions, which then could be supported with guides and facilitators and so on. And so that is very unique, right? And that is, I think, a huge strength of psychedelics. But at the same time, that kind of openness it creates can put you in very dark places too, right? If you're not prepared, if you're in the
Hmm.
wrong context, you can be really opened up and then just be guided through influence, external influence towards like dark, fearful, anxiety, fear-stricken states as well. And so it's kind of this really powerful tool we have to really approach carefully.
You mentioned the inner healing intelligence, and it felt. Let me just take a breath into this. It felt like there is a wisdom inside of us that we can talk also around spirituality and consciousness. But let's just start with that homeostasis that you mentioned, yeah, Manesh. So, what does a mind look like when it has all of the right conditions around it, when it's functioning really well in a really healthy way, when it's got homeostasis, where that person's got friends, family, work, love, health, happiness. So that inner healing intelligence is open, it's flowing, things are working well in that person's life. Like, what does that homeostasis look like for the mind and for the human? And then how does that differ to when someone's got trauma or social determinants of health and it's not got those kind of environmental factors in place?
Yeah, so there's a lot I could say there. I think the general high level thing is difference between flexibility and rigidness. Right? I
Mm.
think a healthy mind is a flexible mind. It's a mind that's able to be in tune with the demands of the moment, to be able to adaptively respond in the way that's appropriate, to be able to entertain different perspectives, to have a sense of openness and clarity and expansiveness. And so I think that kind of less unrestricted, unencumbered mode of this consciousness is um, what we can call health in terms of mental health and flourishing, as you're describing. And in contrast, when somebody has PTSD, or are depressed, or has OCD or anxiety disorder, it's what's characteristic of that is feeling a bit more stuck. You're stuck in a state of fearfulness, of anxiety, of feeling low energy, of being unable to stop thinking about something. And I think that kind of rigidness is a brain that's not in its ideal mode of functioning, right? And so when I say homeostasis, I think you're off homeostasis. You're not in this intrinsic balance when you're stuck really heavily in kind of one state or one type of thinking or one emotional state. And so I think different therapies, but in particular psychedelics, are trying to restore this adaptive flexibility and openness of mind that allows us to confront life's challenges as needed in the moment, as opposed to just acting out past conditioning and fears and subconscious programming. And so that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, that was beautifully expressed. I'm going to dive into talking about depression now because that's a really big piece of what we want to focus on here at Healing Mindset. I've got a lot of experience with depression, and it's helped me be who I am. It's definitely taught me lessons, and um, the way you just described that the well mind, being more open, being more flexible. Yeah, when I'm depressed, it's definitely my mind is not open or flexible. It's really
Right.
stuck and it's rigid and it's negative and it's dark and it's heavy and I can't shake it off when I'm in that space. It's really, really hard. So, when you think about depression, it could be either if you've had any experience with depression that you feel comfortable sharing, or just from a scientific perspective, how do you understand depression? Like what it actually is to a human being? And it could be how it actually manifests itself neurologically as well.
It's a complex question because there's all sorts of different types of depression, which
Mm.
have different clusters of symptoms, right? So the symptoms that are often associated with depression are kind of low mood and low energy, and anhedonia, which is a difficulty or inability to feel pleasure, and then also trouble concentrating, right? In addition to sleep and just fatigue, which I kind of mentioned. And so these things can show up to different degrees for different people, which might relate to whatever the cause is of their particular type of depression. But most commonly, we think of somebody low energy, low mood, trouble feeling pleasure, and also the cognitive issues as well. And in the brain, there's a variety of ways to understand that. Previously, there was this whole, oh, you have a serotonin imbalance or not enough serotonin,
Hmm.
which I think is kind of like I don't believe. I think it's kind of a silly thing that emerged in a way that wasn't totally aligned with the science and was just a very simplified picture of it. And in fact, if it first emerged because they found that these drugs, I think initially it was monoamine oxidase inhibitors and also very early SSRIs, that these drugs, which worked on the serotonin system, seemed to reduce people's depression symptoms. And then they're like, oh, this is probably because people have low serotonin and they're restoring it, right? But this is almost like saying, oh, somebody had a headache, We gave them some Advil, therefore they had an Advil deficit, right? It's the same logic, and that's kind of how it was originally started. And then they try to like back rationalize it by doing studies to then evaluate that, which were always inconclusive, and there's no consistent picture emerging. So anyway, I don't believe it to be a serotonin deficit. I feel like a major part of depression in the brain is a result of chronic stress and reduced neuroplasticity and a disruption of our ability to regulate our emotions. And in addition to that, an overactive nervous system that's dysregulated. So I think these kind of underlying factors are what often give rise to it for people. And so, to unpack that a bit more, we know that when people are chronically stressed, that there's a lot more inflammation in the body on a chronic basis. And over time, that can actually impair the functions of neurons and reduce their ability to be plastic, which is to say, reduce their ability to be flexible in their connections. And over time, this can lead people to be more likely to get stuck in cycles of rumination or of anxious responses or whatever it is, fearful responses. And then it's this thing where you're stressed, you start to get more stuck in these patterns, and you become more stressed, and you become more stuck in those patterns, right? And it's this impairment of neuroplasticity that can
Mhm.
eventually lead to that. And I think, um, you know, with psychedelics and with ketamine, how they can be so useful for overcoming depression is their boost in neuroplasticity. That's a major part of it. And in fact, SSRIs actually increase neuroplasticity as well, just over a much longer period. Over like 4 to 6 weeks later, people do get increases in neuroplasticity. And so there's a lot of people suggesting like, oh, that's actually what matters, not the serotonin is just an initial thing to get the neuroplasticity. So that's kind of one of the main ways I think about it now.
You mentioned something about neuroplasticity that not everyone may appreciate. So I want to highlight that. You're saying that neuroplasticity is kind of bi-directional and it's not necessarily always good and positive. It doesn't always lead to improvements. It can actually lead to depression getting worse, so kind of spiraling. Can you just expand on that, Manesh? Because that's a little bit new, I think, for a lot of our listeners.
Yeah, there's several elements here, right? And so,
Mm.
what is neuroplasticity, right? It's the brain's ability to create new connections between neurons or to modify existing ones. So it's basically how plastic is your brain, how easily can your brain be imprinted based on your actions and your experiences. And the ability to be imprinted and the ability to be plastic is itself neutral, right? You can imagine you have some Play-Doh, you can make something very beautiful and amazing or keep it as an ugly blob, right? It's like you
Mhm.
can do with it whatever you want. And similarly, in neuroplasticity, you can use it to cultivate positive habits and ways of being that promote your health, but you can also use it for things that don't. And for example, for people who are depressed, it might start, let's say, with a negative life event, and they start to think about it and ruminate on it and think like, oh, like I should have done this, or oh, I always mess this up, or there could be like shame spirals and all these things. And so initially, that's kind of this conscious volitional process. They're choosing to think about it, to try to process and understand it. But because the brain is neuroplastic, by doing it over and over again, it gets harder to not do it, right? And then they can get to this place through neuroplasticity where their brain is automatically ruminating about everything all the time. And so then in that way, neuroplasticity has brought you into this depressed state. And then I was saying before, once you're in that depressed state, maybe you're not able to function in the ways you're usually able to function. You're stressed chronically. And that chronic stress can then actually reduce that neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity took you into this stress state, and then that stress state made you lose your neuroplasticity to some extent. Then you get stuck in that stress state. And then you're in this cycle now where you're stressed, and that's making it hard to escape from the stress. And I think that's what happens to a lot of people who are depressed, because literally their depression is making their brain less capable of pulling out of it. And this is where, SSRIs will help restore some of that plasticity by dulling the emotional impact of their experience and kind of creating this plasticity to then restore kind of some regulation of their emotions. And things like ketamine blast the prefrontal cortex with glutamate, which increases neuroplasticity very rapidly. And then looks like psilocybin, the other psychedelics do as well, potentially in a more lasting way. Yeah, for that reason, I think neuroplasticity is really central here.
There's another piece that you're also talking here about is how to maximize the positive neuroplasticity, particularly if someone's in a depressive state. So you can take ketamine, for example. What can they do at the same time, that person, before and afterwards, to maximize the boost of that neuroplasticity? So kind of integration practices. So do you have like this ideal vision of what a person's psychedelic infused journey might look like if they had amazing preparation and integration? Kinds of things would they be eating or drinking or doing, or their sleep routines and social relational? So let's just paint a picture, because I think what you're saying there is if that in combination with, say, ketamine would have the most benefit to someone working out a depressive episode.
So there's multiple layers to this as well. I think on one side, we want to do things which maximize neuroplasticity and minimize chronic stress and chronic inflammation. I think that as a baseline for the prep and just for the entire process is really important. And so this would look like, ensuring you get a good amount of sleep each night, engaging in things such as meditation, mindfulness, breath work, yoga, things which downregulate your nervous system and help you, reduce your states of stress and kind of overactivity. I think that as a baseline is really important. And also a diet is extremely important, like cutting out processed foods and seed oils and a variety of these things which can promote inflammation and inflammatory reactions. Prioritizing whole foods, organic whenever possible, eating a healthy, balanced diet, again, cutting out processed foods, particularly processed sugar. That all makes a big difference in terms of your brain's ability to be plastic as well. So I think as the and exercising is really important. Like doing zone 2 cardio training is really important as well, which is kind of light jog. It's kind of being at about 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. So it's basically jogging, cycling, swimming at a rate where you would be able to hold a conversation while doing it. So like you're active, you're jogging, but you're not overstraining yourself. In doing that, let's say half an hour, 3 to 4 days a week will definitely make a difference in keeping inflammation down and keeping neuroplasticity higher. So I think those are the fundamental basic things that are absolutely essential. And then on top of that, it's like, okay, once you have a bit more plasticity, what do you do with it? And I think on one side is like being very careful about what content you're consuming on the internet and the types of people you're interacting with, because we're really influenced by that. It's like it's important to keep up with the world, as depressing as it is. I think it's, we shouldn't just have our head on the ground, but it's like setting healthy boundaries to manage your own health and well-being is really important. And being aware of how you feel about people socially. Like if you hang out with somebody and it just puts you in a negative energy state, and we all know what that feels like, it's like, don't prioritize that person, right? Um, and then once you have all that, I'm still getting, these are like the basic foundation still. Then it's like, okay, what do you want to implement in your life, right? It's really important to go into a psychedelic experience with the clear intention of something you want to work on, you move through, overcome, and then hopefully, or like most likely, you can get some kind of insight or perspective in your experience, or at least renewed motivation to pursue something. And then it's a matter of how can I concretely implement this in my day-to-day actions, and then creating a plan and then tracking your progress. It's like, oh, like I want to spend an extra hour with the kids each night and be fully present and without my phone, right? And then just setting it on the calendar, and it's like, oh, today I did it. What were the challenges around it? Why did I want to not do it? Or was I fully present? Or right? And it's like being really nerdy about it. Just trying to track and manage your progress. That could apply to everything about wanting to meditate more, spend more time with family, prioritize creative things, not be so reactive with your partner. It's like know exactly what you want to do and try to implement it. And the neuroplasticity would literally make it easier for you to do that. And so just being very conscious of what behaviors and practices you want to use your neuroplasticity for. I think that's the other really important component.
It's fantastic, Manesh. Thank you. Yeah, I love the emphasis here on mindfulness and self-awareness, and in a sense, putting effort into being really conscious of our life, our decisions, and yeah, I love the emphasis on family as well. I know for me, I've got two young kids, and they're probably the best medicines for me coming out of depression. Is just time with them, hugs with them, and being out in nature. It helps me to kind of flick that switch.
Mm.
I was recently on LinkedIn because I spend a lot of time there. I'm sure you know Matthew Wall, Matt.
Right. Yeah.
Um, is a neuroscientist. Is in England, I think.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure he's at Imperial College in London. Yeah.
Yeah. So he recently posted, Manesh, about the striatum in the brain, and so I then asked him a question just to expand more about um, the work that his MRI or fMRIs were showing about the striatum part of the brain, and particularly around addiction, because I've worked a
Mm.
lot in addiction. And so he answered me there saying that what we see with people with addiction is a shift in control from the ventral striatum to the dorsal striatum. And so what that's seeing is when a person's using a recreational drug, and initially it gives them that dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin hit, whatever it might be, but then from repeated use that affects reduces, and then it becomes this more habitualized kind of that rigid piece that you were talking about earlier,
Mm.
and that's where it shifts to the dorsal stratum, where it becomes just habit and really hard to shift. So I don't know to what extent like you're interested in the striatum, but it's something that I've just heard of working in addiction treatment. Do you feel like that's also a really important network of the brain for us to be talking about?
Yeah, that's really interesting. For addiction specifically, I think that's really important. And maybe, yeah, I'm sure more broadly as well. And right, the ventral striatum is your reward system, right? It's your nucleus accumbens. These are the areas that we call a reward system, like the central parts of a reward system, right? And then the dorsal striatum is involved in these habitual motor commands, like the movements and actions we take. And these are very old brain regions, right? These are like much older than the cortex, for example, and very basic. And so a lot of times, yeah, these are the parts of our brain that can override our conscious kind of intentions and our understanding. And um, it's interesting because there are serotonin 20 receptors which interact with these parts of the brain, but we often focus on them less for no good reason, really, just because there's a lot of focus on the cortex, which is the more advanced part of the brain. But I do think that in order for psychedelics or any treatment to be effective, particularly for things like depression, we have to be changing stuff down there in these more kind of primitive areas. And it very well could be the case that psychedelics can help rewire circuits down there and undo this kind of conditioning at this very deep, striatum level. But some of Matt's work is great in kind of pioneering the emphasis on that, and there's a couple other groups also looking at the striatum. But I think that's definitely an untapped area that goes beyond just all the talk about beliefs and thoughts, because this is more about pleasure and just automatic subconscious movements, which is again more basic. And so I do think there needs to be more of a focus on that too.
Thanks, Manesh. You were talking just now about the brain basically going through a chronology of evolution. I don't know if we're talking about thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe we don't know, but is what you're saying there that literally the brain's got older, more integrated components that first evolved, and then it evolved more like the prefrontal cortex, and that when people have addictive patterns habituating, that more of their decision making shifts to that older part of the brain and kind of circumvents the kind of more modern and um, higher functioning part of the brain.
Yeah, broadly, I think that's accurate. Like these days, I mean, in these days, in terms of evolutionarily speaking, our brain is really integrated. So all these areas interact in complex ways, in such that it's possible that our beliefs can then influence these more primitive areas where it's like if we believe something is valuable to us, we'll have more of a pleasure response in these older areas. And so it's not like those older areas are just independently doing their own thing. But as you're saying, yeah, these older areas were present in more primitive life forms, right? Like not even like pre-apes. And so assuming, humans evolved from this line that's more proximately is apes and chimpanzees particularly, we've branched off many times. That that evolutionary kind of sequence going back in time is one where real like like 100 million years ago, right? It was like very basic organisms with different, maybe even basal ganglia, or sorry, striatum. Basal ganglia is part of the striatum, but I don't want to go into that detail. But the striatum and these other areas were present in these basic organisms. Like you could think of them almost like a multicellular organism in the water, that if something feels good, you move towards it. If it feels bad or it's a bad chemical trace, you go away from it. And that's kind of almost like this striatum thing, where it's like you're guided by pleasure, what feels good, and that creates these motor commands, these movements. And you can see how very, very basic things, but as evolution goes, we just kept on scaffolding on these things. And so there are parts of the brain which are much more primitive and like kind of pre-rational, that can sometimes hijack the system.
You mentioned psyche before. Um, I'm really interested in consciousness. The brain's amazing. It's absolutely incredible. I love looking at some of the latest, kind of microscopic fMRI scans of the tiniest, millimeter of the brain. It's phenomenal, the level of detail. But when we talk about consciousness, when I look up at the stars at night, you know, and when experiencing psychedelic, extraordinary states of consciousness, for me, that truly is phenomenal. And in my mind, whatever that means, I'm picturing a Venn diagram, Manish, and that the brain's this big, amazing circle. And then there's another circle that's consciousness. And there is an interlapping bit in the middle there. But that circle that is consciousness is infinitely larger than the circle of the brain in this Venn diagram. So how do you understand the difference between the brain, consciousness, psyche? What is, in a sense, some of your personal beliefs around what we are able to tap into as human beings?
Well, at first I want to say there's different viewpoints on how we can conceptualize the relationship between the mind and consciousness and the brain, right? The most common one that scientists usually hold is that they're both two sides of the same coin, right? And so they're everything in the brain, everything in consciousness is happening in the brain, and everything in the brain has its own kind of side in consciousness. So in that perspective, there's nothing beyond the brain, because brain is consciousness, consciousness is brain. So that's like the perspective a lot of scientists hold. Um, and the thing is that that's a philosophical assumption, right? There's no definitive proof that the brain is generating consciousness, or that these things are intimately 100% the same thing, just different aspects of the same thing. And so, I think more and more, based on my own experiences and experiences that many people have had, that somehow, the brain is more of it allows you to tune into certain states of experience, and it's kind of an interface with something greater. And I do think consciousness is fundamental. It's primary. It's prior to brain in some way. And I think if we look at things experientially, like, because all we know is our experience, right? We make assumptions on this external world that's out there, but really what's external in the external world is happening internally in our experiences. We never able to get out of our experience, right? And so, for purely from the perspective of our experience, what's the most basic element of our experience? It's the fact that we're having an experience at all. It's the fact of being aware of an experience. And I would argue that awareness, that baseline awareness, is consciousness, right? It's like the pure just awareness of whatever's happening. And so in that way, in our fundamental core of our experience is consciousness. I think, that's grounds to believe that, okay, consciousness is primary, everything's emerging or appearing in that consciousness. And there's this thing called the brain, which we call with language a brain, which seems to be correlated in certain ways with conscious experience. But to say it's generating consciousness, or that consciousness is limited to it, again, is a philosophical assumption, or like somebody needs to take on faith, essentially. And so for me personally, I've had and heard many, many experiences of telepathic communication, of clairvoyance, of seeing something happening far away. These days the telepathy tapes is becoming very popular. If people haven't heard of that, search telepathy tapes on Spotify or the internet, and that's kind of crazy, but it's some controversy there around it too. But I've heard enough experiences and had of my own of very seemingly, feeling the boundaries between my thought process and somebody else's start to become blurred, and to have shared kind of visionary experiences. And this kind of stuff happens very often, and it's swept under the rug. It's denied, just because it doesn't fit into our current scientific cultural frameworks of what's possible. But I think if everyone were to come out very openly and share whether they've had these anomalous experiences, I would say the vast majority of people have. It's just not talked about because it's kind of, oh, you're crazy, that you're just deluding yourself, and people are dismissed. But I think there's something to it, and there's like the consciousness, the universe, life is an extreme, it's a mystery. We really don't know that much about a lot of things. And I think it's kind of historical presumptuousness to think that we're like, oh, we're at a place of knowledge where we just know these things. Oh, we can definitively rule out that that's possible. And I don't think that's the case. I think we're just at another point in history where in 100 years or maybe less, we're gonna be like, oh, like, wow, we actually believe that. Just like we think about people who believe, the earth is the center of the universe. And so I think, there's a lot of progress that can be made on these things, and I'm very open to possibilities.
I love that openness and the flexibility that keeps coming up in our conversation. Just briefly, Manesh, I don't know how interested you are in some of the DMT research or 5-MeO DMT research that's happening at the moment, a lot of phase 1, phase 2 work, in particular around consciousness, because that tends to kind of really blast people into a very extraordinary realm. I'm just curious around the what we know about the brain and how DMT and 5-MeO DMT, which are two very powerful psychedelic compounds found in different drugs, do they have any different kind of markers and signatures around how they affect how the brain works?
Yeah, so DMT and 5-MeO DMT are very different than each other. DMT, which is kind of NN-DMT, the classic DMT, as you know, and just for your viewers, it puts you in this very deep, immersive, dreamlike state for a relatively short amount of time when inhaled or vaporized. That people feel like they're entering into a different, independent reality for a temporary period, and they might report interactions with seemingly autonomous entities and beings and stuff like this. And if that sounds really wild and out there, it's because it is really wild and out there. And there have been studies on brain imaging studies of DMT, and they found signatures very similar to things like psilocybin, but just at a much more intense level. And there's some evidence suggesting that the DMT states shares, and this is different than psilocybin, it shares qualities that are a combination of psychedelic, but also dreams. It's tapping into these kind of theta brainwaves and
Mm.
these patterns of processing in the brain that usually only happen when we're dreaming. And the thing about dreaming is we are generating an immersive perceptual experience in the absence of inputs from our senses. And a similar thing happens in DMT. So somehow it's inducing this dreamlike state, but with very bizarre things happening, which are kind of out of this world. And so what that means, we don't know. That's like the level of the brain. Okay, it's similar to dreaming, which is to say it's similar to creating an internal world that's not based on what we're immediately surrounded by. So it's a fascinating area, and there's DMTX studies now where they hook people up to an IV of DMT and give them a sustained infusion to keep them in that space for 45 minutes. And these people are reporting insane kind of journeys throughout these independent realms, and of like kind of these like metaphorical lessons being told to them, and really like a crazy psychedelic lucid dream that they go on. And I mean, that's extremely fascinating. I would love to try it myself. I haven't. And that's like, I think that's the frontier of like kind of consciousness exploration
Yeah.
science, is that. Um, and then 5-MeO DMT is very different because 5-MeO doesn't induce necessarily a dreamlike experience with entities and stuff. It just blasts you into complete oneness and then non-duality, and you lose all sense of being an individual or being in space and time. It's just full-on ego dissolution. And that too makes people feel like, oh, like I've transcended all material reality and like gone back to the void or the white light. And there's some studies starting to look at that in the brain as well. but there's no fMRI study yet. We're trying to do one here at UCSF, but there's none yet.
Oh, wow.
And that is an interesting one too, because like, oh, what does it mean to have an experience that seems to go beyond all material reality? Can we really just say like, oh, that's just the brain state? That's not real, even though experientially it seems really, it feels like that's happening. And so there are a lot of things intertwined, like the intersection between philosophy and neuroscience and psychopharmacology and different frameworks on how reality works. Like this stuff, this is why I find it so fascinating. It just like makes us question and think about all these very fundamental things.
Oh, you're a lucky man, Manesh. And you just mentioned some of the work that you're doing at UCSF. Maybe just tell us a wee bit more about that. What are some of the studies you're currently working on or things coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, so UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, we've mainly been focusing on psilocybin. We just finished the biggest brain imaging study of psilocybin to date, looking how different people respond differently to psilocybin in terms of their brain response and how that changes across successive experiences. And so we're looking at that in detail. We're also doing the biggest ever study of set and setting, the effect of set and setting on psychedelic effects and brain imaging, which I'm excited about. And yeah, we just recently submitted a grant to try to do the first ever fMRI study of 5-MeO-DMT, which has its own challenges because you got to stay still in the scanner. And so we're being very selective. Once if we get the money to do it, we got to be very selective on who gets in, because if anybody's heard of 5 or tried it, it's very hard to stay completely still. And so this is something we're trying to finesse, but we really want to see how does 5-MeO's effects on the brain differ from things like psilocybin or NN-DMT using fMRI, because we don't know. We actually just don't know. And this is a big gap because 5-MeO, as you know, David, is like being shown for its therapeutic potential for depression more and more. And it seems in certain cases to have similar effects to psilocybin, even though it's like a 20 to 40-minute experience, which could potentially be more scalable, perhaps, because it
Mhm.
requires less physician time, might be cheaper to do. And so there's a lot of potential there, but we still know much less about how it works in the brain. And so this is something we're also trying to work on.
You also work at Center for Minds as well. You've got a position there, and they're doing some really creative stuff. I don't know if any of the projects involve, meditation. If not, let's talk about the two separate things. But yeah, for me, meditation is just a really interesting component of life when we're talking about kind of lifestyle, homeostasis, self-care. I think meditation has a lot to speak about with similarities to, psychedelic use, psychotherapy, and it's yeah. So anything around meditation, as well as secondly, yeah, your work with Center for Minds. If you could tell us a wee bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that meditation is such a core thing to influence how we experience the world, right? And I think it's a basic fundamental skill that everyone should have. And when I think of meditation, I think of being able to train yourself to be anchored in the particular focus or state of awareness where you're not automatically pulled into what's happening. It's kind of having an anchor within yourself and being able to maintain an equanimity amidst all the stuff happening, amidst all the chaos and changing, um, aspects of experience. And so, for me, that's really fundamental for navigating psychedelic experiences, but also just navigating life and managing your emotions and staying kind of integrated and kind of expansive. Just having awareness, not getting bogged down. And at the Center for Minds, we do, first of all, Center for Minds, we're a nonprofit research organization that's trying to advance research on psychedelics, but also things like meditation and mindfulness and other practices in terms of how they can help increase creativity and facilitate insight in real world contexts, such as in engineering, in science, and different kind of social applications, and is how we can really leverage these tools for these aims over and above therapeutic. We're not really interested in the therapeutic aspect, but it's more about creativity and insight. And it's a lot of research on meditation and mindfulness, actually, particularly how they can lend themselves to cognitive flexibility and this exploration of less kind of familiar ideas and literally change the brain to let us be more creative in our thought process. So there is a growing literature on that. Um, in addition to one on psychedelics, which is much smaller and more early stages, in terms of how psychedelics affect different cognitive processes related to our creative thinking. And so, yeah, Center for Minds were trying to help advance that research by raising money, providing grants to research organizations, and creating a research agenda, and these kinds of things.
Personally speaking, Manesh, anything that you're working on you want to tell viewers about, particularly, with your YouTube channel, any education that you're got coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, so I, decided a few years ago that I don't want to stay in academia. That's a whole other topic. But so I'm like, I still enjoy collaborating, writing papers, and doing these things, but I'm more so focusing on this public science educator role and consulting for these different organizations. And so in the science education area, I really am leaning into expanding and offering more educational materials at the intersection of psychedelics and neuroscience, but also mental health and just like longevity and health. So I think these things all come together in order to have that kind of, flourishing mind that we talked about, and to be able to have the resilience to face all the challenges that are in the world these days. And so I do have a psychedelic medicine masterclass, which is aimed at practitioners and therapists who are interested in psychedelics, to educate them on all the major topics in the space, and including like from the history to safety and risk factors to the neuroscience to the different applications. And I just it's about 7 hours plus of content on all that. And then, and a 200-page ebook that I co-wrote with my co-teacher, Melanie Pincus, who you know as well, David, is also a neuroscientist, which also distills all that research. And then I'm just about to launch another course, which is more aimed at just individuals. And it's more of like a harm reduction course on how to safely approach, navigate, and integrate your psychedelic experiences, and how to best understand neuroplasticity and how you can leverage neuroplasticity for change. And that's a more practically oriented course that I'm soon to launch as well. And then, as you know, for Psychedelics Today, which we've worked on in the past, there's a psychedelic neuroscience course that I co-taught with, again, my colleague and friend Melanie Pincus, which is more of a in-depth technical dive into the neuroscience. And so, yeah, those are the three different offerings. And people can hear about my courses and such through my website. If you go to maneshgirn.com, go to maneshgirn.com/masterclass to see that one. And you can sign up to my mailing list through the website as well. But yeah, I'm really big on sharing all this knowledge. I think it's fascinating. I think it's important and can be really useful in a practical way for people as well.
Amazing. I'm going to check out, those masterclasses and that 200-page book. And I'm really hoping there's some pictures as well.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One final question before we sign off, Manesh, and that's a two-parter about the state of psychedelic research and scaling into the mainstream. What excites you the most about the potential of psychedelics in mainstream society? And then what, on the other side, is the greatest obstacle or roadblock to achieving that potential?
For me, something I'm really excited about is just the potential for psychedelics to expand people's awareness of the capacity for people to change and to transform themselves. And, a lot of people who come into these research studies have had depression for 20, 30 years. Nothing has worked. They've tried everything. And for some of them, not all of them, but for some of them, psilocybin helps them break out for the first time ever and helps completely change their life trajectory. Like these people are in like their 60s. They've been depressed since they were 30. And that's a huge deal. And a lot of people would say, oh, it's not possible at that point. And so I'm really excited about psychedelics showing the possibility of change, not only in mental health, but also in beliefs and orientation to life. And because I really think when they're properly supported in the right context, they lead people naturally to be more open, accepting, tolerant, loving, and feeling a connection to humanity in a deeper level. And that's, as we know, what's sorely needed in this world these days. And so I think there's a lot of potential for the right use of psychedelics for that. Um, and in terms of challenges and pushback, I think psychedelics really are unique, as we've described, and so they don't fit into typical models of healthcare or psychiatry for that matter. Because psychiatry and a lot of healthcare, in terms of drugs, it's like we're just going to give you this drug, take it on your own, and it'll make you feel better, right? There's a lot of less emphasis on we're gonna hold space for you to go through this transformative therapeutic experience and navigate emotional challenges and memories and help you integrate and make sense of it, right? That's kind of like, unfortunately, kind of quite out there compared to how healthcare and psychiatry often works for mental health. And
Mm.
it's also very resource intensive, right? And so I think we need changes in systems to allow for this kind of therapy to be more easily integrated. But then we also need ways to make it more accessible and to allow more people to have access to it in terms of potentially doing group models or different kind of subsidies around it or insurance coverage or what have you. And I think that, is going to be a really big challenge moving forward because I think initially it's going to be really an exclusive thing when it's medicalized for all people who can afford it. But I think what's really important is making it more available. And I think that's a big challenge. It doesn't have easy solutions.
Beautiful. It's amazing to hear you say that as, an expert neuroscientist talking really about the kind of economic, social, and cultural models and policies that are going to enable us to actually benefit from these psychedelic medicines to heal ourselves. Beautiful.
Mm.
Thanks, Manish.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Really a pleasure. Thanks so much, for everything.
Thanks so much for having me, David. Yeah, always a pleasure to chat with you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Take care until next time. God bless.
Take care.
Thanks again for watching, and thanks to our sponsor, MAPA Minds, a network of next-generation mental health clinics offering Spravato and ketamine treatment for depression. Go to mapaminds.com for more information.